right, everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us today for this lecture, our second lecture of this semester of the lecture series entitled Critical Practice. As you know, this lecture series invites reflections on the evolving roles of the designer and architects as critical agents of shaping equitable, resilient, and culture-grounded futures. The lecture, in many ways, brings practitioners and educators working across architecture, engineering, construction, landscape, and urbanism who actively sort ways of thinking and approaching design that is both transformational and about caring for the built environment. I will move on and introduce Professor Bassam Mansour, that everybody knows very well, for him to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, David. All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special lecture. I will begin with our university's land acknowledgement statement, say a few words about the Michael Theiss Fund and Michael Theiss himself, and then I'll introduce our speaker for this evening. We acknowledge that we are on the lands of Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashal, Uia, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, South, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the ancestral territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal, and continue to carry their stories and their struggles for survival and the preservation of their identities. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois bears a responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of disposition that enabled the institution's growth over the last 150 years. This acknowledgement, along with the commitment to centering Native peoples, is only the beginning as we work toward a more just and equitable future. This evening's lecture is supported by the Michael J. Theiss Memorial Fund. The fund was created to honor Michael Theiss's keen interest in integrated architectural and engineering design. Mr. Theiss received his education here at the School of Architecture, earning a Bachelor of Architecture in 1970 and a Master of Science in Architectural Engineering in 1971. His career as an engineer spanned over 2 decades, many of which he spent in New York. His project work included design of tall and distinctive buildings, as well as restorations and renovations. Michael J. Theiss Memorial Fund is used to support events at our school to encourage and promote the study of structures in architecture while facilitating interaction between students and practicing architects and structural engineers. We are grateful to Michael Theiss's late wife, Cindy Theiss, as well as Mr. Theiss's friend, Ron Johnson, for their support and of this fund, which makes this evening's lecture possible. And now a few brief introduction of our speaker for this evening. Ron Klemencic is the chairman and CEO of Magnusson Klemecic Associates based in Seattle. MKA is a highly regarded structural and civil engineering firm with a long and consistent history of turning dreams into reality. Mr. Klemencic is a licensed structural engineer and professional engineer in many states, as well as an honorary member of AIA, a member of the prestigious National Academy of Engineers. An industry innovator and preeminent structural engineer, Ron is recognized for his creativity, big picture approach, and ability to produce cost-effective designs. He has designed projects in 29 states and 25 countries, with some as much as 11.5 million square feet and 112 stories, including San Francisco's Salesforce Tower, Chicago's St. Regis Tower, 150 North Riverside and Aqua, as well as Seattle's Rainier Square. In addition, he has led the research and development of industry advancing innovations, including speed core and performance-based seismic design. I first met Ron over 20 years ago when he was the chairman of the Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, and I've had the pleasure of knowing him and benefiting from his expertise over the years. Please give a warm welcome to our special guest, Ron Klemencic.
Well, good evening, everyone. Congratulations to the Illini. An outstanding basketball season. Better than my Purdue Boilermakers. Sorry that you didn't make it further, but it was a good season and a good run. So, how many of you are architecture students? Almost all of you. How many of you are engineering students? A few? Anybody dual degree? Okay, excellent. So, I'll try and lean this in the architectural direction, but I am an engineer in my day job, so I'm going to talk about engineering too, because that's what I do. Before I get into the presentation itself, I just want to give you the punchline straight away. So if you choose to decide to tune out and get on your phone, you can do that. But here's the punchline. You know, the title says it all, but I've been thinking a lot about successful collaboration between architects and engineers. And I've kind of come up with two thoughts on this. And one is the relationship that's established and the best collaborations, the best outcomes come from trust and caring. If you care about each other and you trust each other, you have the best outcome. That's one. And then two, and this is mostly for the engineers in the room, architects like to dream big and have big ideas and vision. And engineers oftentimes are too modest and kind of are in the shadow. And the best buildings are the outcome of a strong collaboration where the engineers have an idea as strong as the architects. So, and architects, remember, the structural engineer is your friend. We make all of your dreams come true within the constraints of gravity and budget. That's what we do. So when we have these ideas together, the architects trust the engineers trust the architects, and we work together, we can come up with some pretty miraculous things. So the presentation I'm going to show you tonight really is some highlights, some stories of projects where I've lived that experience. And so I just want to share with you some real life experiences of those kind of thoughts, this trust, this caring, and mutually big ideas and how they come together. So, all right, before we get into that, I get the great pleasure of working on crazy buildings all over the world. There's a few of them. I work in all of these places all over the world. We do it from Seattle, and we have a small office in Chicago. But we travel around working with architects on virtually every continent and on all kinds of different things, big and small. A little bit of history, because I always think it's good to know history. When I was an undergraduate student, I got a minor in history because I thought history really teaches us good lessons. So in my case, our company started in 1920 by a guy named William Witt, who was a structural engineering graduate of the University of Wisconsin. He migrated from Wisconsin to Seattle and established a company in 1920. And did a bunch of local buildings in the Seattle area and the Washington kind of northwest region of the US. In the 1940s and 50s, along came a guy named John Skilling. And John Skilling is really the individual who laid the groundwork for our firm and really launched us into kind of what we are today. And most importantly, John Skilling's good friend and classmate at the University of Washington was Minoru Yamasaki. This is the beginning of that trust and that caring and that relationship between an architect and an engineer. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but in the 50s they were doing a lot of thin shell concrete construction. And then along came in the 60s and 70s some really brilliant engineers that joined the company, in particular Jack Christensen, who was a savant in concrete design, and Les Robertson, who's absolutely brilliant structural engineer. And they did all kinds of miraculous things in the 60s and 70s. The World Trade Center towers in New York, the first Diagrid building in Pittsburgh, the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, all across the country starting to work on these miraculous projects. And a lot of it was an outgrowth of John Skilling and Minoru Yamasaki's friendship, and that trust and that collaboration. And then along came a guy named John Magnusson in the early 80s. And John led us into a new era of kind of modern construction, modern buildings, composite construction, all kinds of new technology. And then in around 2000, I came along, and here we are today. So that's our company history, but rooted in that, all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, was this relationship between the architect and the engineer and this collaboration. So here's a building I want to highlight very briefly because it sets the table for things to come. This is a building that John Skilling and Minoru Yamasaki did together in Seattle. It happens to be where our offices are located in this building, the Rainier Tower in Seattle. And the idea that Yama had was he wanted to take this building and raise it 12 stories in the air because that got the building above all the surrounding buildings at the time were only 12 stories tall, and everyone would have a view of the water then, which is a big deal in Seattle. And so we went to Skilling and said, well, how do we do that? And Skilling came up with a couple of ideas, but ultimately they settled on this one here, this, I'll call it the Rock of Gibraltar. Some people call it the Gulf Tee. But put the building on a 12-story tall concrete pedestal, which is what the design ended up being. And what people don't really realize above that Rock of Gibraltar is this very light steel structure. And it's a steel moment frame structure that exists on top of it. That at that time in the 1970s was a particular, shall we say, popular way to go about designing the structure of tall buildings. We just happened to put it 12 stories in the air on top of this pedestal. But that was the kind of makings of that collaboration between the two. And I asked John Skilling, I got the pleasure of actually working with John early in my career, and I asked him about this particular building. And I said, you know, that was brilliant, this idea that you guys came up with. And he smiled and he laughed. And I said, what did you think about that? He goes, well, yeah, I let Grandma think it was his idea. Anyway, there it is under construction. Well, that laid the groundwork for then almost 35, 40 years later, we got a call from John Buck in Chicago. And Mr. Buck wanted us to design a building, which ultimately ended up being 111 South Wacker. But that was the beginnings of a relationship for me personally with Jim Getch. And the idea back then was similar. Surrounding that site were buildings that were about 15 stories tall. And so the first ideas that Jim and I came up with were, well, how do we raise the building 15 stories in the air? And Jim came up with these first few models. And I said, well, wait a minute, we've already built this building. It exists in Seattle. We made it out of concrete, but this is Chicago. We need to make it out of steel. How do we do that? So we started toying around with these kind of tree column ideas, these sloping columns. And this is where Jim and I really kind of launched into our collaboration of how to best do a version of Rainier Square in Chicago, not in concrete, but in steel. And so we went along developing these different ideas until we got to here. And the building had grown in height and gotten more bold, and the market was good. And then right here, something happened, and the something was 9/11. And so at that moment, the world stopped. In fact, many said there'll never be a high-rise building built ever again. But about a year went by, and the phone rang again, and Buck said, okay, it's time to go again. But I can't build this building because that's too scary to people. You need to come up with something else. So the idea was, well, how do we still achieve that raise of the building, but have it appear less frightening to a public that was freaked out about tall buildings? And so what we came up with ultimately is what we built on the right there. What you don't see is in these floors that were used to be air, those floors now here are actually all parking. So the first usable floor of that building is still at level 12, where people are actually residing in their offices. And everything below that is parking. But the whole design response to kind of what was a public sentiment at the time was we need to make it look more safe. How do we do it? Anyway, to the engineering, how we did the engineering was fairly simple. On each side of the building, there's 2 columns that touch the ground. And on top of those columns that stand up about 80 feet in the air, there's this V column that goes up and splits out and grabs 2 more columns above. So we traded 2 columns above for 1 column below so that we touch the ground more delicately. And here it is when we're building it. And so how you build these things becomes equally important to how you design them. So that collaboration then extends to the contractor. How are we going to actually make this? And so how this works, you see, here's one of those big columns that touches the ground, goes to here and splits into the V. The V goes all the way up to a point where it grabs a node, and then this column right here is actually hanging from the top of the V. And this piece here and this piece here are just temporary. We put them in temporarily so that we could build the building from the bottom up until we completed the top, and then we could take the column out. So on one fateful Saturday morning, they said, Ron, come to the site and stand right there while we take that column out. This is your design. It should be safe, right? You stand there. We'll take the column out. So we did, and it worked. And it turns out to be a beautiful building. All right, so we had this idea of raising the building up, getting up above something else, but we didn't really realize it in this building. We still ended up with these 2 columns on each side of the building because of the 9/11 response. But this idea was still kind of in our heads. This is another thing that happens with architects and engineers, is we get on these themes, these tracks, these ideas, and until we perfect them, we'll kind of relentlessly pursue them. And so we had this idea one day about putting 2 towers on the top of Union Station in Chicago. Union Station is a historic structure, historic architecture. You can't really touch it. But how do you take 2 office buildings and then insert them somehow surgically through Union Station without mucking up the history of the building? And so the idea was hatched again that we do something like we had thought of in the beginning. In this case, the tree column thing's buried in the building, and the building only going through Union Station with its elevator core. No columns, nothing else would go through Union Station, just the elevator cores, because that's what needed to go there to get the people up and down. Anyway, it was a concept. We pitched it to a bunch of people. No takers. On to the next one. So then we found some clients in Abu Dhabi. And this is the Abu Dhabi Financial Center. So we actually got to build it on a smaller scale. This is kind of an experiment, but here we are. And we built it. It was only about half the size of what we had hoped. But it was actually realized in Abu Dhabi. And then the big opportunity came. 150 North Riverside. The building right on the Chicago River. And this was not designed for what I like to use the term architectural conceit. This is architecture for a reason. Right? And the reason was the site was right on the river. It was covered with railroad tracks. And we had to put this blue shaded thing, which is the building, on top of all the inbound railroad tracks that were operating, and we couldn't touch the tracks at all. So how do you put this building that wants to be in this position over the top of all those railroad tracks without putting foundations and columns and things in the way? So we hatched this idea again. We pulled it out of the drawer, said, this is the time that we're going to live the big dream right now. So we're going to create this very tall tower, and we'll have it only touch the ground with the core. We're going to go back to our tree column or sloping column idea, and we're only going to touch the ground with the core. Now, normally a building that tall, for the wind loads in Chicago, for the sway of the tower, we need to put in something that engineers would call outriggers. And the outrigger is a lot like the ski poles for a skier. You can imagine if you're a snow skier, if you don't have your poles and you stand on your skis, you're a little wobbly. As soon as you put your poles out here, you're a lot more stable. Same thing with a building. When you put these two columns out here and put these trusses, which are like arms reaching out to the poles, it stabilizes the building much. Well, if we did that here, the column or the ski pole, if you will, would be in the middle of the railroad tracks. Can't do that. And the other one would be in the river. Can't do that. Oh my goodness, now what are we going to do? Because the client really wants to build a building this tall. The other thing that structural engineers will note is that we use this term aspect ratio. And the aspect ratio is the height of the tower divided by the width of the base. And it's not just the width of the base, it's the width of the base of the building that braces the tower. So in this case, we were going to have this tower, something like 700 feet tall, on top of something that's only 35 feet wide. That's 20-to-1 aspect ratio, 700 feet divided by 35 feet. Now, if you go into a structural engineering college textbook on high-rise design, they'll tell you that the normal target aspect ratio for a good design is 8-to-1. That's kind of boring. 10-to-1, okay. I might need to think about it for a minute. 12-to-1, I might turn my computer on and actually run some analyses. 15-to-1, I've made the cover of a magazine somewhere, because that's really slender. This building was 20-to-1. Never been done before. How do you do that? So that was our challenge. It's 40 feet wide, I lied. So it was a little bit more than 700 feet tall. We're going to touch the building with just the red thing, which is the elevator core. And when we design tall buildings, we calculate the wind load on the side, and then we plot graphs like this, that this is the sway of the tower. So this is the height of the building, and this is how much it sways in the wind. So you can see this building is leaning over quite a bit, and this red line is what we would call the don't cross this line. Oops, got a problem. I passed the line. What are we going to do now? The other line that we look at is this is about occupant comfort. Across the bottom here are windstorms. 1 month, 1 year, 10 years, 50 years. How often does the wind come? Of course, more frequently, less velocity. Least frequently, very high velocity wind. And these little dots and dashes here you see is what is quantified as how people feel in the building. We call it occupant comfort, but it's how someone might feel if the building's swaying back and forth. Do I get seasick or not? And so if we're below these dashes and dots with this line, which is the performance of the building, we know the people in the building won't get seasick. In this case, we did our analysis. The line is our building. We're above that threshold. The people are going to get sick in the building. That's not good either. So the building's swaying too much and the people are getting sick. That's not a good day. So what do? We got 20-to-1. Have to come up with another idea. What's our other idea? Oh, we're going to put a damper in the building. In this case, we put on the top of the building a series of water tanks. And the water tanks act to lessen the sway of the building. So how they work, these are the tanks in plan view. How the water tanks work are very simple. In this diagram, you see something that engineers will know. We call it unbalanced hydrostatic force, meaning the water on this side of the tank is deeper than the water on this side of the tank. What that means is the force on that wall is a little bit bigger than the force on that wall. That's due to the sloshing of the water in the tank. So the idea was if you can design the size of the tank and the amount of water in the tank so that as it sloshes back and forth, it counteracts the natural sway of the building. So they kind of going like this. They cancel each other out and the building rests very quietly. It actually works. You have a question?
How much water was needed for this to happen?
How much water was needed for this to make this happen? A lot. I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was 120,000 gallons. Not a trivial amount of water. But that's the science of it. It's very simple. A lot of times, the simplest things work the best. That's what we did. And lo and behold, the red line, whoop, back to the blue line. We scored a goal, and the green line dropped way down, goal. Let's go build the building. And so we did. The other part was, how do we manage the gravity forces in this building? So down the outside of the building are the columns, but they all need to get into the core somehow. So how we did that is we built what's amounting here to an upside down arch. Think about the St. Louis arch. Our arches are really good in compression, but they can be equally good in tension the other way with a tie. So this is a tied arch upside down. Here's what it looks like in section. The blue things are part of the tied arch. And these are the pieces. So this is not for the faint of heart. This is where that sloping column comes into the vertical piece. And they're not small pieces, right? These aren't tinker toys we're playing with. These are life-size, real pieces of steel. Those are the two largest steel sections that they make in the world. And we were putting them together side by side to double them up. Very significant pieces of steel. And those are the base plates for the columns too. 12 inches thick steel base plates. So for structural engineers, this is like, love this stuff. All right, so we built the building. It was very cool. It was very fun. They built it from a crane on the river. And that was that building. So we're going to move on, and now we're going to talk a little bit about my friendship with Jeannie Gang. And Jeannie, University of Illinois graduate. She was actually contemporaries with my business partner, Dave Ekman, who runs our Chicago office. Anyway, we do a lot of work with Jeannie. She's very brilliant, and we have lots of fun together. But again, back to that trust and that caring, and that the architects have a big idea, the engineers have to have a big idea too, to complement it. That's where the magic comes. All right, so here's the Aqua building in Chicago. There's Jeannie in her office. She gets down and dirty, man. She's climbing around the furniture. In this case, you see the first of about 500 strings that she strung from that building. And the idea, one of the ideas was she wanted people in the building that when they're on their balcony, they all have a great view and they can see around the adjacent buildings. So a lot of why the building's shaped the way it is, where it's further out, where it's less far out, is influenced by the views around all the adjacent buildings, as she discovered when she was with her strings in her studio. That was in her backyard. We built a big model. And this is me toying with my own models. So the big idea was we wanted this crazy squiggly slab edge. So you're looking in plan view at a floor. Every slab edge for 80 some odd stories is different. Every edge is different. But inside that is the most simple rectangular box that you can possibly imagine. What you see here, these red things, are part of this system that braces the building for wind. And otherwise, it's a very simple rectangle. It's almost the simplest structure we could possibly imagine for a building of this tall. It looks incredibly brilliant and complicated, but it's actually incredibly simple. So there it is, a little bit better view. Every floor slab is different, but the structure that you see there, the red and the blue, it's the same all the way up. And it's basically a rectangular box. Building the slab edges was the trick here. So here we have the architect, the engineer. Again, we got to collaborate with our contractor friend. How do we build the slab edges? So for this building, we actually helped design a new kind of formwork system to form the slabs and allow our cantilevers to be more aggressive. And then the slab edge form itself was a bit of an experiment, because what we wanted to do is every floor being different, we wanted to be able to lay it out very quickly and then reuse it. So we came up with a piece of steel with just the right thickness that would hold the wet concrete when it's being cast. But then after the concrete's cast, you could take it off. It would spring back to straight, and you could reuse the piece on the next floor. And that was that building. So I'm going to switch now to a whole nother set of buildings, not high-rise buildings, but now some lower-rise buildings, with another friend architect, which we have a great collaboration with, a guy named Joshua Prince Raymond. There's a company called Rex in New York. Josh, at the time, was a protege of Rem Koolhaas. And this is the Seattle Library that we designed together with Rem, but Josh was really the guy who did the work. So there's the model from OMA in the beginning. That's what we built. They've got some similarity to each other. But the big structural idea was, okay, that wacky building, how do you hold that up? Rem and Josh came to our office with this model and said, here it is, figure it out. And so again, now you're faced with that. The structural engineer has to come up with a big idea. Well, what's your big idea? And so the big idea was this idea of a belt. A belt that holds up your pants. In this case, we were going to build this belt truss, these couple of floors here in the middle, that would hold everything below it and hold everything above it. And so that belt hangs several floors below it, and it posts up several floors above it. And that was the big idea for this building, was we were going to have this belt structure in the middle and then work off of that belt up and down. In the end of the day, it's gorgeous space. If you happen to get to Seattle, I invite you to go there. It's open to the public. It's the public library. And if you get that opportunity to walk into the main reading room, you'll go, all you architect students, you'll go, oh, this is good. It's very much like a cathedral. It's a very, very fantastic space to be in. There's many, many, many more stories about that building. That's for another lecture. But with Josh, he broke off on his own, and we started doing other projects together. He formed Rex, which is his company today. And we did this project in Dallas, Texas, the Wiley Theater. And so this was an interesting assignment in that the theater wanted to build a new facility, but they had this tiny little parcel of land. And they needed to somehow fit their entire program on what was this tiny little parcel. So how do you do that? And so Josh's big ideas was, well, we'll take what was the normal arrangement of how you normally build a theater, where there's the front of the house, there's the performance chamber of the theater, and then there's the back of house. And there's a fly loft for the scenery and what have you. We'll take that whole concept, which is normal, and instead we'll stack it, and we'll put one on top of the other. And we're going to fit all of this program and this entire concept on this little postage stamp site. That was like the big idea, architecturally. So here it is a little bit in a cartoon form, a little bit better view of what it really looks like in terms of how the program stacks. But then the question was, all right, if that's our idea, how do we actually hold it up? And this is where the back and forth begins with Josh and the teams collaborating. So there's what we want to do, and we went back to what? Our belt truss. So we're going to use that same thing we just did on the Seattle Library. We're going to use that idea again, because it worked pretty good. But we got to hold up the belt truss somehow. We got to put some columns in. So we put 4 columns in. That's all simple enough. And we showed this to Josh, and he goes, yeah, hate it. What else you got? Because one of the other aspirations of the architecture was kind of opening up the ground plane as much as possible, which we thought we did, right? It's wide open here. But what we fail to recognize is the main view of the city is on the diagonal back here. And that comes smack dab in the middle of the main view back to the Dallas downtown. We also had to brace the building. So this is a structural engineer's view of, well, that's how you brace it. You put some big diagonals in, and yeah, Josh, yeah, I hate it. What else you got? Well, we'll move the columns away from the corner, and we'll brace them. Yup. Nope. Not good enough. Try again. We'll move them further away from the corner. What else do you want? And we'll brace it. No, still not doing it for me. How about if we start sloping them? Ooh. We're getting warmer. I'm starting to feel it now. Oh, how about more? I love it. Yeah, this is good. Touchdown. Go build it. So this is the model. That's what we built. So that was this very small encapsulation of what was months of back and forth and lots of bottles of wine consumed and lots of fun sketching. The other big idea that Josh hatched in this project, which was a first for us, was something like movable seating. So once again, because this was a very tight footprint, but yet they had all these different ideas on how they wanted to use the building, Josh had this idea, I think he just seen the movie Transformers, right? Where the car turns into the robot and takes over the world, that thing. Well, this building is a transformer in the sense that you can manipulate the stages and the seating. So you begin to see those red things are seating tiers that raise and lower on hydraulics. So they can reconfigure the theater. There we built it. And then we said, well, let's extend that, and we hang them up above. So we got this big flat floor now, and we hung the seating up there, and we're going to stuff some down in the basement. We'll put it all on hydraulics, and we'll move it around to reconfigure into these other seating configurations. And so this building, that's what got built, is this notion of the transformer, and how do you actually realize that in real life. The building's absolutely beautiful. So once again, if you're in the Dallas area and you have a moment, go there, and you'll go, I know why you told me to come here. It's beautiful. Back to Jeannie. Jeannie's, one of her big inspirations is nature. The Aqua Tower, not only the views, but the kind of erosion of that building has its roots in her interpretation of the Wisconsin shoreline along kind of the northern side of Lake Michigan, the northwestern side of Lake Michigan. And so for this building, she had another natural inspiration, which was crystal. So we'll take this crystalline form, and now let's turn it into some architecture. So she started toying around with different shapes and how to stack the shapes to come up with some kind of vocabulary here, some kind of idea of what the architecture might be. Meanwhile, we had that meeting, and she showed us the crystal, and she showed us these things, and we go, okay, let's go do some math and science, because that's what we do. And we love it when we can describe what seem to be complicated shapes with like math formulas, because then we know how to analyze things and we can rationalize them, and it makes us really feel good because we can do smart math. So that shape is actually technically called a frustum. It's the actual name of it. It's a truncated pyramid in layman's terms. So we said, okay, these frustums, things that you want to stack up and make this building, it's a residential building that on its lower levels look like this, and then it terraces back again, and then at the very top it's very tiny. And here's this frustum shape, fine, we're going to do this. But from an engineering point of view, we've got to still deal with these loads that come down, the columns. And the columns are now kinked, they're not vertical. Well, how do you do that? Because when the column kinks, there's this other force that develops. It wants to burst in this case. Well, that's not good. Or vice versa, when the columns kink the other way, the force is a compression force, and it wants to crush itself. How do we deal with that? And then lastly, the floor slabs themselves have loading on them, and the floor slabs want to deflect. And so structural engineers, one thing we are frightened of is something called buckling. And so when you have something that's in flexural curvature like this, and then you push on it, it wants to buckle even more. This is really a bad day. So these were the challenges with that shape. So we started to think of what are the solutions to that. And of course, it's Chicago, and we've got to deal with the wind. So how do we brace this building for the wind? So we said, well, normally we put concrete around elevator shafts. We'll put some cores in them. But that's not enough for this building that's this tall. So we'll supplement those cores with these, we'll call buttress walls. And these buttress walls in plan view, the red things, extend out from the cores, and we'll put these big blobs on the end of them to make them really strong. And then that's not enough either, so we connect them together. Now we have a system, and this is, I'll call it a structural big idea. It's very clean, very tidy, very efficient. And we showed this to Jeannie, and we showed it in particular to our client, and what again? Hate it. In particular, what I don't like, what a client didn't like, are these big blobs here, because they got in the way of how to lay out the furniture in the residential units. They got in the way of how the curtains wanted to work. They got in the way of how the views wanted to work. What else do you have? So the response was, well, we'll get rid of the blobs, and instead we'll just make it a couple of boxes. We'll smooth this out, get rid of the big blobs, and then we'll poke holes in this wall for the windows. Everybody was happy. And that's what we built. So here it is in section. Now, along the way, here's a funny story a lot of people don't know. You'll know. So when we started the building, the frustum shape, right? Like this, like this, like this, like this. It had a certain slope to it. The client, again, said, I don't like the slope because the apartment unit on this floor is too much different than the apartment unit on this floor. So all the internal design is different. So what I want you to do is take that and go like this and make the frustum less of a frustum. Not quite vertical, but less when we started like this. Now, fine. The problem that created was when we had the more steep angles and the wind blew on the building, those steep angles helped actually reduce the wind response of the building. As the building gets more and more and closer and closer and closer to vertical, the wind response of the building goes way, way up. It acts a lot more like a chimney. Yep. Says it in the college textbook. Yep. That's what happened. So when we went like this, we had to go back into the wind tunnel and say, the building, when we designed it originally, let's just say the overturning of the building in the wind, let's call it 100. 100 what? Doesn't matter. It's 100. And then when we went like this, it was 150. That wasn't so good. So how do we solve that problem and get us back to where we want to be? So we went in the wind tunnel and we started testing variants of the building. Myself, Jeannie, Mark, her husband, their staff, we were in the wind tunnel with the wind tunnel people figuring out, well, here's our baseline model. We're going to deal with this stuff that's called vortex shedding. So what happens with vortex shedding is the wind is blowing this way, and as the wind comes around the building, these little eddies are formed, and the wind breaks off the building as it flows around the building. The problem with that is if those little green eddies, as they break off the building at just the wrong rate, the building sways that way. Kind of counterintuitive, but the wind's blowing this way, and instead of the building swaying back and forth this way, the building's actually swaying back and forth this way, which we call the dynamic amplification or a dynamic response or a crosswind effect. There's a lot of names for it. But in tall buildings, it's a particularly bad thing we try to avoid. But we got that when we went from this slope to this slope. So how do we fix that? Back in the wind tunnel, start playing around with our design. And what we played around with was, how do we start to tinker with the shape of the building? So back to this, here's our baseline. You see the flat top, non-porous, here's our building. In this model, all we did was put some porosity at the very top of the building. We let the wind flow through at the very top. And then we tinkered around with some other things, like we put this blow-through floor in. If you go up to Chicago now and you see that building built, you're going to see that. I'll come back to that in a minute. Looking closely at this, maybe more at this image, you see the edge of the building or the facade is kind of crinkled. That was an attempt to, again, confuse the wind, make some roughness, make the wind load go down. Combine them together. We did countless iterations of different things we might do, and then we plotted them all. So here's where we started, 100. When we put the porosity in the top of the building, the screen wall at the very top, we went from 100 to 85. This has a screen wall, a screen wall, a screen wall, and a screen wall. This is some variation of crinkled side, eroded corner, all kinds of facade tricks. None of them really worked. The only thing that was effective here was make the top of the building porous. And then we put the blow-through floor in that you see on the skyline now, kind of the gap in the building. And that got us to 65. And we went from 100 to 65, mostly through the blow-through floor. That was the solution, but that was this almost trial and error between the architects, the engineers, and the wind tunnel to figure out how to get back from what was, remember people getting sick in the building? Here's our green line. Oop, that's bad. And we put this blow-through floor in the building. and everything got rosy real quick. So the other thing we did in this building, again, we like this liquid mass damper. It's really easy to build. We put another one in this building. So at the very top of the building, there's actually 4 tanks. At the very top, and then about 10% of the way down the tower, there's another 2 tanks in plan view. Again, very large. How much water? A lot. There's a smaller tank, but those things, again, help settle the building down and sway. Jeannie, once again, on a much smaller scale, right? We went from the 3rd tallest building in Chicago to a 1-story building in Chicago. This is my favorite project of all time. I'm a tall buildings guy. People around the world, they call me up because I'm the tall buildings guy. This is my favorite project. And why is it my favorite project? Because the people that we got to work with on this project were so fun and so brilliant and so creative that the process of actually figuring it out was all the fun. So this is in Lincoln Park, north side of Chicago. You can go there. This was Jeannie's original diagram. She goes, I want to build this picnic pavilion. I got this idea of this little kind of arch-shaped shell. This is what I want to do. And we said, okay, fine. So we started doing some analysis of this, and this is our first analysis model. And what you see in this is we tried to mimic the geometry she drew. But what we were discovering is there were kind of 2 major arches resisting most of the load. And then all the other pieces were kind of going for the ride. And we said, that's great. That's very efficient. But what it'll mean is these blue and red colored pieces, these big pieces here, they'll be big and everything else will be small. And that really wasn't the vision she was looking for. She wanted everything to be kind of same. All the pieces the same. All right, so we're going to play around with the geometry. So if you look at that, and then you look closely at this, and then you look finally at that, you can see us playing around with the geometry, kind of stretching it and making it smaller, and playing around with whatever shape you want to call that, ace of spades. That shape to this shape to the final shape, to where now the stresses in these pieces are all very similar. So now all the pieces can be identical. Good place to be. So here we are. Beautiful. We made a computer model. She made a computer model. We're all wondering at our computer model. It's beautiful. And then the question, well, how do you make that? Because you wanted to make it out of wood. Well, wood in buildings before this had never been bent in 3 directions. Bent in 2 directions, but not in 3. How do we do that? We actually had to go in the laboratory and start experimenting and breaking things and making beams and trying to figure out how to bend wood in 3 directions. What we ended up with is first we went and talked to boat builders. We were thinking, people who make wooden boats, they surely know how to do this. And initially they were very enthusiastic, and then they go, no, we don't know the 3D thing. We can do 2D. And when you think carefully about it, yep, in boats, the hulls of boats, wood is bent, but it's in 2 dimensions, not in 3. And I, wow, that was a strikeout, now what? Anyway, fast forward, we turn to furniture builders. And furniture builders build at a much different scale, like a table. But they know how to bend wood in 3 dimensions. Like, that's brilliant. How do we take what you know, combine it with what we know, collaborate, and make something that nobody's ever done before, which is what we did. And so that thing that you're going to see here in a minute in its finished state, in the end, is 3-dimensionally bent wood. And to make that entire structure, there's only 3 unique pieces. This piece is piece A. This is piece B, and that's piece C. And if you make those 3 pieces over and over and over, and you attach them together just right, you make that building. And that was the beauty of this. It's so very simple. It looks so complicated. Then Jeannie said, well, I got another challenge for you. I don't want to see these big gnarly steel plate connections. I want to hide them because I want it to be all about the wood. So we borrowed from the past. This isn't anything we cooked up. This is from like the 1800s. It's called a spike plate. But if you take a steel plate and you put all these little steel knobs on them, and then you press the wood together, and those knobs bite into the wood, it locks the wood together. So that's what we did. And then the bolts that you see out there in the field, these little bolts, are just there to keep that thing held together. The spike plates are doing all the work. The bolts just kind of keep it clamped together. It's very easy to put together, only 3 pieces, only some hand tools, a couple wrenches, voila. There you go. It's been on the cover of magazines, this thing. It's miraculous. It's beautiful. Lots of people go there to have their wedding pictures taken. Anyway, go there. It's another cool thing. All right, I got 2 more, and then I promise I'll be done. But they're too much fun, right? All right, so Amazon. Everybody heard of Amazon? Okay, kind of. All right, this is the headquarters for Amazon in Seattle. And you don't really see until I point at it right here. There's this thing called the spheres. And Jeff Bezos, former founder, chairman, CEO, former, because he's relinquished his corporate duties, had the vision of, when my staff wants to take their coffee break, I want them to go to a place that is the world's best coffee room. And in fact, I want that coffee room to be inhabited by 40,000 plants. Because physiology tells you if you're in an oxygen-rich environment, your brain works better. So for all his really smart people, he wanted them to go have their coffee break and get smarter. That was the concept. How do you do that? So he says, I want to take a historical conservatory, like a British conservatory, and I want to interpret it in a modern way. How do I do that? And of course, we looked at some reference structures. And here's a normal way, here's a normal way, here's a normal way. That's all been done before. Great. What else you got? That's no fun. I want that. That's cool. How do you do that? Well, we start sketching and doodling and start making some computer models. This is in 2012, so this is a while ago. Yeah, more interesting. Yeah, still not doing it for me. It looks too much like something I already saw before. Then one of our junior staff members happened to go with, her mother was visiting from out of town, and they went to this store called Made in Washington. I'm sure they have a Made in Illinois store too. There's a gift store, right? Buy trinkets. Anyway, they had this lamp. You've seen this lamp. You've been in the same store, right? You've seen that lamp. And she took a picture of it and she brought it back to our studio and she goes, I think it might be this. And we said, that's brilliant. I think you're right. And that lamp, now back to math and science, there was a mathematician named Catalan. He developed geometric solids, the description of geometric solids. And amongst the different geometric solids that he categorized, Mr. Catalan, he cataloged something called a pentagonal hexacontrahedron. Bullseye! That's what we need, a pentagonal hexacontrahedron. What the heck is that? All right, it's a soccer ball with 60 sides, 60, hexa, 60-sided soccer ball made of pentagons. That's our structure. It's brilliant. Only there's one problem. At the scale that we're talking about, we want the soccer ball to be about 120 feet around. So you do that, and then you decide how big these pieces are. They're pretty long, which means they get pretty big. And the architect of this building, MBJ, they go, that's lovely, but pieces are too big. We want them to be smaller, more delicate. How do we do that? So we had this idea, all right, we'll take our pentagon and we'll reinforce the pentagon somehow. We'll stabilize it somehow. So we did this parametric study of all of these things that are ways in which you might fill in a pentagon. you look closely, all of these things are pentagons, and there's something inside of it, and the something inside is meant to stabilize the pentagon. At the end of the day, with the architect, the fabricator, the erector, and ourselves, we settled on this one. And the reason we settled on this one is the pieces were nice and delicate. The architect was happy. The fabricator could bend it and shape it and make that easily. The structural engineer was happy because it satisfied the stability and strength. The contractor was happy because they could build it. So what do you do when you come up with something like this? You name it the Jedi Fighter.
Yes.
So there's our pentagonal hexacontrahedron. There it is in reality. And there's the Jedi Fighter. So if you go to Seattle, now you have 2 reasons to go. The library and the spheres. You can go show all your friends, you know, Luke Skywalker used to fly that. And there it is. Mock-up. And then we build it. And there are 40,000 plants inside of it. And there's only a little small area where the public can go because it's for the Amazonians to have the coffee. Right. All right, last one. Back to Josh. Josh Ramus, our dear friend, the Perlman Performing Center for the Arts in New York City. This site was one of, not the last, but one of the last sites to be developed at Ground Zero. And where it sits, WTC 1 is One World Trade, the big tall tower. And our site was right there, right next to it. So particularly important site for all kinds of reasons. Site sits right there. All right, so way back in the beginning, 2004, 20-something years ago, 22 years ago, the Perlman Center hired Frank Gehry. And Frank Gehry came up with this design similar to the Dallas project where it was a small site, but they had a very ambitious program, and so they wanted to stack the theaters on top of each other. So this was about a 20-story tall performing arts center with one theater stacked on top of the next, on top of the next. And Frank designed this. We worked with Frank, we designed it, and we actually had to figure out how to build it over the top of the railroad tracks, because once again, here we are building buildings on railroad tracks, and figure out how to shoehorn this thing into that site and hold it up in this very difficult location. There's the railroad track. So the building wanted to sit on top of that. So we did. We figured out how to put that building there. We ended up touching the ground in these few places where those red dots are, where we could squeeze things in between the railroad track. And we designed it, and we built it. Stop. We built it back up to grade, to street level, and then they ran out of money. Full stop. It sat there for almost 10 years. Nothing happened. So 10 years later, now we're 2015, Michael Bloomberg shows up with a bag of money. Says, we got to finish that theater. I'll donate the money. Let's do it. So they did. But they had a new architectural design competition, and many architects competed for this, Josh Ramus being one of many. And the idea was, well, how do we put a downsized version of this, a downsized theater on that site that's already half built by Frank Gehry. So this is what Josh said when he was finally awarded the project. If the site were not the absolute right place to build this, it would be the absolute wrong place to build this because it's so freaking complicated. Between the complications of its proximity to the tower, its location over the railroad tracks, et cetera, et cetera. So many things made it very difficult. And now we've got to figure out how to do this stacked programming then. But Josh, taking cues from what we learned on the Dallas Wiley Theater, said, all right, here's his early sketch. We're going to make a building, not only do the seats move and transform like Dallas, the entire building insides are going to transform. The walls are going to move. The stage is going to move. The seats are going to move. And it's going to reconfigure and reconfigure and reconfigure and reconfigure, et cetera, et cetera. That's the big idea. Okay? we were not putting a ship in a bottle. We were putting like 10 ships in the bottle. That's my sketch. Very tidy, isn't it? And this is me sitting with Josh trying to figure out how we're going to put his building, which is the blue one, on Frank's building, which is the red one. How do you marry the two together? This is us scribbling, trying to figure that out. So there's where we got to touch the ground. Once again, we're going to put Josh's new building on top of Frank's old building. And so we got to marry these two together, stitch them together somehow. And then we got to build this cube that inside the cube, everything's going to move. On the outside, it looks very simple. But on the inside of this, so we create this structure, this volume with the structure. That's very simple shape. But inside, everything's going to be super complicated. To make it matters worse, right, we're over the railroad tracks, and this is intended to be a performing arts studio. Not just one, but many. So the trains are rumbling by down below, and they transmit vibrations up through the building and, on a bad day, into the theater and disrupt the theater. That's bad. So we got to fix that problem too. So how do we do that? So it's not completely clear in this picture, but I'll try and describe it. That is the ship, and that's the bottle. This is a building inside of a building, and that inside building is sitting on top of a whole field of rubber isolators. So these boxes, which were the theaters, I'll go back and do that again. These are rubber isolators on which the theater boxes sit that isolates them from the train below, and then we clad the whole thing with a nice, very pure cube form. There's the isolators, big pieces of rubber. And here's how that theater works. The theater and the staging and the walls, etc., can be reconfigured in 60 different configurations. So you can have up to 3 simultaneous performances going on at any one time, or you can have one big performance and variants in between, inclusive of, here's 450 people seating, here's 500 people seating, goes all the way up to about 1,000 people seated at a particular performance by not only moving the seatings, but we also designed these acoustical wall separations that we call guillotine walls. And the walls go up and down like pieces of a set on a theater performance, but it's a big acoustical separation wall that's hung from above and is raised and lowered to create the space. It's the most complicated building I've ever worked on. It is very much a Swiss watch of building. So we went and we built it. You see some steel plates here, another complication. We're next to One World Trade, and we got to think about all kinds of unthinkable things. And so protect the people inside from bad things that might happen outside. That whole cube is surrounded by steel plates. Keep the people inside safe. The rigging, the lighting, all these things move, and it's incredibly complicated, but ultimately very brilliant and very beautiful. So if you go to New York, another place for you to go. They do have, I think, regularly free performances in this venue. You don't have to pay $500 a seat every time that there are free performances in here. That was part of the idea of the whole place, to go and see things, and it's really quite a beautiful piece. It's very simple from the outside, massively complicated on the inside. A product of these collaborations and these big ideas that we have together. Here's where it sits again. Here's One World Trade. There it is down at the bottom, completed. Yeah. Anyway, enough stories for me for today. I hope you enjoyed them. But remember, the caring and the trust is where it's all rooted. We care about each other, we listen to each other, we trust each other, and that's what's the basis of the collaboration. And then we both have big ideas, and it's great fun. Anyway, I get to do all this stuff. It's my life. It's fantastic. That's it.
Thank you very much. Really spectacular. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes.
I have two questions. You said to stop the vibrations from these trains going up, you guys using rubber. Could water also have been used to dampen the vibrations there?
So the question on the Perlman was, can you use other materials other than the rubber, like perhaps water, to dampen the train vibrations out? The simple answer is yes, but we didn't. The rubber is super effective, and why it's super effective is you think about vibration as a wave. And as it travels through a material as a wave, if it hits a material with a different density, the wave form gets confused and it kind of stretches out because it doesn't know how to go through that material. So the whole trick was putting a different kind of material with a different density in than the concrete and the steel below and the concrete and the steel above. The rubber is the right kind of break in the system, if you will, because it's strong enough to hold up the building, but it's got enough, its properties are different enough from the concrete and steel that the vibration waves get totally confused. So that's why we chose rubber. Could you use something else? Yes, probably not water, but could you use something else? Sure. I don't know. Leather? I made that up. I don't know. Sure.
And the second question, for the Riverside building in Chicago, were all the forces, or like were the main forces transferred to the central beam just at the bottom diagonal, or were forces transferred along each floor or something as well?
So the question was on 150 North Riverside as we came down the building and sloped everything in. Did all the force transfer happen just at the bottom, or was it somehow done incrementally over the height? And the simple answer is it was all done at the bottom. We could have taken a strategy to do it incrementally. That's a cool design. I like that. Maybe we'll do that one. That's cool. The reason we didn't do that is office building developers, that was a speculative office building, meaning they needed to lease it. And pieces that get in the way of the space planning generally are something they don't like very much. So we wanted the tower, the office plates to be very clean, the columns vertical, nothing in the way, they can plan it out, and then all in one go like that in one fall swoop. Interesting thing about that building, I like this one a lot actually. I learned this myself. If you go to Chicago and you take the architectural boat cruise tour, which is very fun, I encourage you to do it. It's really a fun tour. And you get to see all the stuff and the docent's telling you all the story. When you drive by that building, you can take a picture of yourself not doing like this. The building can't, and the reflectivity of the glass is such that you can see yourself standing on the boat on the side of the building. So you can take a picture of the side of the building and see yourself on the boat. It's very cool. And then you can send it to your friends. Anybody else?
Other questions?
It's done.
Other questions?
Everybody wants to go watch the basketball game. No, sorry. Illinois not.
Ron, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Not related to your presentation, but since we have you here, this is important. The Speed Core.
Yes.
Can you give us like a 3-minute brief of what it is and how it affected design and construction of
Okay.
tall buildings?
So, Speed Core. So, here's the problem statement. The problem statement was when we build lots of tall buildings, office buildings in particular, many times, like 150 North Riverside, there's a concrete core that's surrounded by steel framing. And the problem is that the concrete core can be built at the rate of about 1 floor per week. And the steel can be erected 2 or 3 or 4 times faster than that. So there's this lag in the construction. So oftentimes you'll see this concrete core going up, and it's way up in the air before the steel erection starts. That's because they'll catch each other. So what we were trying to do, what the idea was, well, how do we squeeze that out of the schedule and not have the cycle time on the concrete core drive the entire construction schedule? So how do we do it different better? Different better with Speed Core. And so what Speed Core is, the best way to give you an analogy. It's like an ice cream sandwich. And there's a chocolate cookie and a chocolate cookie, and there's some ice cream in the middle. There's a steel plate and a steel plate with some concrete in the middle. And so we make the chocolate cookies, the steel plates, 2 of them in parallel in a shop. We connect them together with some pieces in the middle, some spacer rods, if you will. So when it comes out to the site, it's like a big Lego block. So it's 1 story tall and it's 1 bay long. So it's 14 or 15 feet tall and it's 30 or 40 feet long Lego block. And then we stack them up one by one by one by one. And that makes the core. And you can do that really fast. You can do that at the same rate at which you can erect the steel. We come back later and we pump it full of concrete, the ice cream. But the ice cream can come later off the critical path so it doesn't drive the schedule. But the ice cream in that case is what gives it its added strength and stiffness. So it's a sequencing thing ultimately to go faster. But what it is in technical terms for the engineering guys, it's a composite wall. It's a steel plate, concrete in the middle, some rods that connect them 2 together and make composite action. That's the piece. But anyway, that's what it is.
And so there was a project in Seattle. How much time did that save?
So the project in Seattle, Rainer Square, was the first one in the world to be built using this system. That building was originally designed with a concrete core. We changed it to speed core, and we went from a 32-month schedule to a 22-month schedule. We saved 10 months on the construction schedule. So it's huge, 1/3 savings. We've since built another building in San Jose, California, same result. We're currently building a building for MIT in Cambridge, outside of Boston, under construction. We're designing one in New York City for Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital. We're designing one in Busan, South Korea. We're designing one in Auckland, New Zealand. So there's lots more coming because everyone took note and go, oh, that's something. Yeah.
What's the name of the one in San Jose?
It's called 200 Park Avenue. That building's not as tall. It's only 19 stories tall. But we saved, again, 1/3 of the time of construction on that building.
So that was Ron's idea, and then there was a lot of research done at Purdue, and now AISC actually has specifications on how to do that and everything. So
sometimes we come up with stuff that's good.
Yeah, I mean, so I just wanted to, since we have you here, I wanted to let the students know. Yeah.
Is there a reason you wouldn't use that technology these days? I mean, it seems like
Fear. It's new. And so here's now I'm going to get very philosophical, but in the world of construction and design, but I'm going to stay in construction mostly, contractors and subcontractors, they figured out how to do what they do and make money doing it. And they want to keep doing that because they know how to make money.
so the answer is contractors, which is
So to do something new that they've never done before, for them it's very risky. I don't know how to make money doing that. I'm frightened. So I'm going to try and convince you to do what we always do because you should have one of those because I can make money doing that. And I don't know how to make money doing it. That's the biggest friction. It's just the science and the math and the experience says you should do it on every building. But it's not on every building because people are afraid of doing things that are new.
Did you have another question?
What's your best, what's your advice for getting past that fear? You talked about trust and communication, so how would you build that trust to get past that?
Yeah, so the question was about how do you build the trust to get past the fear factor. It takes a long time. The building that we built in Seattle where we actually implemented this, that client, owner of that building is somebody I've been working for 20 years. And we built like 6 other buildings together. And so there was a lot of trust. And I went to him and I said, well, we got this idea. Nobody's ever done it before, but your building's perfect for this. Do you want to give it a go? And he said, yeah, okay, we'll try. So, but that was, you couldn't do that with a first-time client. It'd be very hard because, it takes a long time to build that trust and trust is the word.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Have you guys done any mass timber?
Yes, sir.
skyscrapers?
Lots of mass timber. In fact, I was commenting earlier, so our company was founded in Seattle in 1920. We were doing mass timber before they knew how to call it mass timber. We live in the Pacific Northwest. That's all we have is trees everywhere. So we build things from them. But yeah, lots of mass timber these days. I was commenting on our current under construction mass timber projects at Texas A&M. It's a new building for a new college that Texas A&M has created. And it's under construction right now. So if you happen to find yourself in College Station, go look at that one. You'll see live action. The one we just finished is in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And we've got them all over the country now. So yeah, lots of mass timber. It is very popular. It looks beautiful. Architects love it because it's beautiful. It's very sustainable. There's a good storyline there. It costs a lot though. That's the rub. It costs a lot. Compared to concrete or steel or other things you would normally build, there's a premium. So you gotta want to do it.
With it becoming more popular recently, have you seen that same like fear of people like trying it out and doing it, or not?
No, the fear is less so. The what's preventing it from becoming more prevalent is cost. Because people go, oh, I want to do mass timber, and then they find out how much it costs, and they say, yeah, maybe not. Because it costs, depending on what you're doing exactly, it's, well, I know structural dollars, so on a building, it probably is 10 to 15% more costly for the building. No matter what all the marketing bullshit tells you, that's what it is. The reality is it costs about 10 to 15% more. So if you want to spend 10 or 15% more for your building, you can have this beautiful building, it just costs that much more. So pretty well.
Is that taking into account reduction in like construction times?
Everything. Yeah. So you listen to all the marketing bullshit. Back to reality.
Does that cost, like, why does it cost more? Is it something that as technology improves, the cost will come down, or?
That's a really good question. I think it lies in part there in terms of there's only very few limited number of suppliers in the country. There's only a few limited number of suppliers in the world, frankly. So it's not like ready-mix concrete where like in any given place there's dozens of them. There's a dozen in the United States for mass timber. Less than that, actually. There's about 6. So that's part of it. So there's not that much market competition. Secondly, those 6 that exist have limited capacity to produce. And as they get booked up, the price goes up. Supply and demand. High supply, price goes up. Splash the demand. So that's part of it. And in the current CLT floor panels, it's just a lot of material. It's 7 layers of wood. It's a lot of material. And truthfully, the only thing that's really working in that 7 layers are the outer 2. The inner 5 is garbage, it's throwaway. It's a spacer to get you to the outer 2. So there's something for you to invent. Come up with a CLT panel that maintains its strength and stiffness with the outer 2 laminations and fills the inside with something else. Want to be a millionaire? Want to be a billionaire? There you go. Somebody invent that and you'll rule the world. Yes?
When I was an architecture student in Boston, a little over 30 years ago, I remember going over the case study of the Hancock in Boston and the solution with the big concrete damper. And now seeing in your presentation the water, the solution with the water. When was it done for the first time to use that for a tall building to counter swaying?
2 mass damper?
Yeah.
Very first time. That's a good question. I should know the answer to that. I would say the Hancock building in Boston, if it wasn't the first, it was nearly the first.
And it wasn't, and it was almost like a retrofit.
It was a retrofit
So it was a
because
solution to
the windows were blown out of
Yeah.
the building, and they had to settle the building down, so that was a retrofit. That might have been the first. If not, it's of the vintage where it would have been the first, as a tuned mass. Damping had been added to buildings for the first time. I know this one. The first time damping was added to a building was in the World Trade Center towers. That was the first time, but that was a passive damping. That was with a viscoelastic material. The first time a mass was used was about the vintage of the Hancock Tower. That may have been the first one. Maybe not, but if not, it's very close to the first one. These days, we MKA tends to favor water tanks over other types of dampers because they're very simple to build and they don't cost very much. There's all kinds of tuned mass dampers, not only the Hancock with the big concrete block that's being pushed around by hydraulics, but like another one that's very famous is in Taipei 101 in Taiwan. It's a big ball and a pendulum and it swings around. And the trade-off between the damping types at that scale is volume. Steel weighs 490 pounds per cubic foot. Water weighs 62.4. Scale factor. So I need a lot more space for the water tank than if I don't have the space. I can make it much smaller if I use a stack of steel plates or a big block of concrete or something that's heavier. So that's the trade-off.
Thank you.
What's the sustainable impact of water dampers? Also, associated up, it says Highcliffe Apartments in Hong Kong were the first to use them.
So the Highcliffe Apartments in Hong Kong was the first tower to use a tuned liquid mass damper. But the first one to use a tuned mass damper, I think, was Hancock. You wanted to know the sustainable?
Yeah, the sustainable.
That's a good question. I don't know. I thought about that as a isolated item. But I guess I'd say water, which is replenishable, versus concrete or steel, which is a manufactured product. There's a story there. What's the math? I don't know. I haven't done it. But yeah, it seems like it would be more sustainable. I always get the question, what happens if the tank is empty? Would it fill back up?
But the different damping systems have different maintenance costs as well associated.
Yeah. So different maintenance costs. Again, now we're getting way down the rabbit hole. So there's active systems and passive systems. Active systems require you plug them in. They're driven by computers. We tend to not favor those because what's the first thing that happens in a big windstorm?
Lose power.
Power goes out. So now the thing's got to be on an emergency generator, and forget that. Passive system, you don't plug it in, it just does what it does. The pendulum damper, the sloshing damper, they just do what they do, and they're there, you don't plug it in.
All right, well, let's thank Ron one more time.
Thank you all. Have a good night. And